and pass up. So general reactions to the article, and also your thoughts on good mental models and metaphors for this kind of thing where, large scale systems are being driven by updates and so forth. So Stephen, take it away.
I was adjusting my headphone. I actually worked with Kubernetes, which is the main technology that I work for. So even after working with Kubernetes, I found that the process of understanding what exactly happened with the network is a bit confusing, but the general idea is basically updates are just killing the data related to networking, and then it can't detect each other and it can't recover because the control plane nodes, which are basically the part of Kubernetes that kind of controls everything, the whole entire cluster, got shut down too. I found that the article to be, fairly detailed on like the side stuff, but I felt like the core problem wasn't very clear, which is kind of funny. In terms of what a good metaphor, Kubernetes is a bit hard to, I'm trying to think of a metaphor here. I guess a metaphor I would think of would be, you could kind of think of, well, this is the old Kubernetes terminology, I forgot what they call it now, but the control plane nodes are kind of like the masters, and the other nodes are kind of like what they call secondary nodes or something like that. I forgot what the name is, but basically when the masters are gone, the secondary nodes can't come up again. So you can kind of think of like, I don't know, commander soldier type metaphor, I guess. That's the only metaphor I can think of right now off the top of my head. But yeah, I guess that's all for me. Gregory?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Good. I was thinking that the key problem that happened had a lot to do with communication. And why is communication difficult in such situations? In my view, it's because at a certain point, at a point of failure, the communication team has to turn 180 degrees from the regular practice. And failure happens like in 2% of the cases, the 2% of it, like 98% of the time. There's no failure, but when failure happens, you have to turn around suddenly and start doing something that you haven't been doing for a long time. Why is that? Because from what I can see, the company kind of incentivized to hide its internal complexity when everything is fine. So basically, they probably have one company slogan, one team slogan, one service level agreement for everybody, etc., etc., etc. So basically, what they present themselves to the outside world as one company that basically do service for everybody according to service level agreement. But when the failure happens, this internal complexity starts to pop up. So before the failure, basically you were talking to the world as something uniform, but after the failure, you have to acknowledge that failure happened. You have to describe the situation, which is different from what you were telling people before that. You have to do some kind of a diagnostics and try to find the problem. Then probably you have to make sure that you have resources to solve the problem and finally solve the problem. So it's becoming pretty complicated, even in terms of communication, partly because you have to reveal now internal complexity that you kind of were hiding from the world. And partly because there are a lot of steps that you are not actually, as a communicator, well aware of or well trained. The metaphors that I am thinking of are mostly medical. When you are well, there's kind of no point to get into gory details of what's going on inside your body. So you can direct your attention towards some productive use of your time. You are working on, or probably you are learning or something. But when something happens to your health, there is a lot to learn. And you can learn that there are certain diseases and there are certain organs inside you and there are certain, parts of your body that operate in a certain way. So it's getting hard partly because you are not well and suddenly you have to process a lot of new information you're not familiar with. And at the same time, you are learning about some failures of the healthcare system, for example, if they don't treat you well, or you think that you don't treat it well. So basically the same dynamics as in case of Datadog. You get hit twice. The first hit is actual failure. Second hit is necessary to learn quite a lot of the stuff that you are. And I will pass it on to Ben.
Yeah, so I enjoy these sort of incident recovery stories because they're always such fascinating looks at the internals of all these huge systems. This reminded me of one of my favorite. I just linked it. The story of the NotPeta wiper that from Russian cyber attack in Ukraine that got out of control and nearly blew up the world's biggest shipping conglomerate. Would have caused immense damage, but they got lucky. And one of their domain controllers effectively was saved because he was offline in Ghana because something had happened and they took it off. And then they had to go and rescue that thing, fly it back to the main offices in Europe and Germany, I think, and use it to recover the system, which is why they weren't completely obliterated. Obviously, that's more intense and awesome than this what happened to Datadog, but you can see the same sort of things. I think a lot about centralization versus decentralization, and I try to move beyond the sort of, I think, very naive ways of looking at it. And these kind of systems are very fascinating to me because this is a centralized system that tries to be decentralized, but has always hidden centralization just due to the fact that they're the same people who all set up the different things. So yeah, they had 5 regions, 3 different cloud providers, so many things that seemed like would help against this sort of thing. But the fundamental flaw was that they set all this up. So they all use the same minor config issues of these VMs. So it's yeah, okay, sure. They probably didn't even remember that this sort of legacy update path, or were even quickly aware that it existed, or that this could be a thing that happened. But because they all set it up, they all set it to the same time, because of course they did. They did not think that was a relevant variable up until it was, and it took out their whole cluster and cost them $5 million. And that is that's very interesting because they were trying to be decentralized enough to avoid these sort of cascading total failures of the system, but hidden centralization, just due to the fact that they were the ones that set this up, still caught them. And you see this with a lot of so-called centralized systems because Google and all the other major players, they're quote centralized, but in fact they're spread out over many data centers, many providers, many backups, precisely because they know if you one server couldn't power all of them in their wildest dreams, even a supercomputer. But at the end of the day, they know that they want to be robust, and that means random stuff's going to happen. And I'm not saying that they should try to be more decentralized. I think this is probably the best Datadog could do. And given the structure of what Datadog is, if this is probably this is going to happen. You're going to have tiny things that you never even thought were a problem that will eventually spiral out of control. But you just have to, as the major point of the thing, you just got to have people working on it. You got to try to fix it when it comes up. And you got to try to have good communication, good documenting, good organizational practices. I'm not saying that, they should all just, switch to, independent nodes instead of Kubernetes or something. My point is more, it's very fascinating to just sort of, cut apart these systems and see how they'll eventually fail. And obviously, like I said, they had a thing that they knew that updates spread out over the whole cluster happening at once had the potential to cause a massive correlated outage, which was exactly what happened. And they had rules and operations in place to not do that. But in fact, they did it accidentally because there was this config that they didn't even realize they had set on cloud providers that was the base OS for all their nodes. So they would be updating effectively all at once or very close to it. And they didn't even sort of realize that. I don't know. I'm not sure I have any grand results or sort of conclusions. It's just very fascinating. I love watching things break this way. So I'll continue going up to sorry, I can't pronounce your name right now.
It's all right. Thank you. Yeah, I found the article fascinating too. It was really cool to see sort of like a postmortem report of what happened. And as I was reading through, my previous knowledge of how these systems work was quite high level. So I had some intuition as to they must have had, different cloud providers. So that must have provided some redundancy along those lines. And as I read, I found that they were overwriting those nodes in those different cloud providers with their own OS image. And sort of that trickled. And so that caused their system to go down across all those different cloud providers, which was something I learned new. And another one I sort of found, I guess the main point, one of the main reasons why it broke was the sort of Cilium roots that had a problem with, I guess, removing those network roots when there's an update to the system, and that apparently was identified and fixed June 2022, and this was in March 2023, so about 9 months before. And it seemed like there was an oversight from the engineers or from the system administrators at Datadog while pushing this new update, which again, it tends to happen. And but yeah, I just thought that this, even sort of in a extremely complex systems like this, some dependency like that could cause a serious outage like this was fascinating for me. And that I guess the lesson for me personally is that in such systems, one needs to be aware of all dependencies and all systems that you are depending on for your system to operate well. In terms of the communication, I mean, an article referenced the best practices that Datadog had written about postmortem communications. I thought that was funny, and it seems like there was some. Again, as I was reading through the article, when I found that some customers were informed and some weren't, my intuition was that it must have been some sort of account management or support systems not communicating the things to the customers. But I sort of found it telling that the CEO, during his sort of quarterly earnings call mentioned that, oh, everybody has access to this information, but turns out everybody didn't have access to this. So it seems like they have some serious internal communication problem as well. So in a sort of observability platform like this, you would expect not just sort of bleeding edge sophistication in how they orchestrate and set up the systems, and also it seems the communication systems within the organizations also need to follow those sort of rigid standards that everybody is on the same page. But that wasn't quite the case here. But again, I found it. Again, another thing I sort of learned and sort of was fascinating to me was other companies that do well. It seems Cloudflare is quite fast in terms of how they communicate with their incidents. That was also an interesting bit for me. In terms of a metaphor for similar complex distributed systems and updating it, I was thinking about the merge recently. It's not quite a metaphor, it's another technical systems, but the merge was quite, there was a lot of things that could have gone wrong, and it was like almost like an odd swap that they did with Ethereum, and it worked very well. And so I went to the merge page, and they had referenced like odd swapping engines for like an interstellar voyage. That's how they compared the merge to, and I couldn't come up with a more creative metaphor, so I asked GPT for some similar metaphors, and it gave me like a building renovation where you're doing building renovations while the building is still operational, and so you've got to manage the ongoing activities and the safety of the people residing in. Another example it gave that I found interesting was like an orchestra conductor to coordinate different instruments and different musicians into a smooth, harmonious performance. So it seems like there are other systems, but I was not happy with those metaphors, but at least it did better than what I could come up with. Anyway, I'll pass it on to Venkat.
Right. Yeah, reading this, I was wondering to what extent, when you're dealing with these complex distributed systems, things that look like it would be like bad customer service or support failure in a centralized system are actually symptoms of like much deeper issues when you're dealing with decentralized systems. Like looking at the structure of this failure, it looks to me like it's a manifestation of the CAP theorem, right? So you've got consistency, availability, and partition tolerance. And availability is basically downtime to mitigation or something. So that's one variable. Consistency is if you're running a rolling update across like thousands of nodes, individual customers having like maybe dozens of nodes. I don't know how the distribution is. But consistency means if you're using the system, all your nodes that you're accessing or touching should be in the same state, which means the update can't like leave them in like a inconsistent state where half the nodes are updated and the other half are not updated. And the partition tolerance part is, I imagine some mitigation of like this kind of problem would be, well, you separate out the system into two subsets and you try the update on one subset first, and if it works, you roll it out to the rest, or some such, I don't know, graceful strategy. But then you have to partition the system, and maybe for various reasons, depending on the application, the system does not like being partitioned that way. So I'm wondering to what extent this whole situation is actually like something you can't get away from, and is like the CAP theorem in disguise. I was also, I don't know, thinking of the root cause in this case got me wondering, like it was a Linux process that's process number one, and if it fails, it reboots. And if it's part of like a sort of rolling update chain, then the whole tree kind of reboots or something like that. So I was trying to think, yeah, I do use some software even on my laptop that seems to have like bad update processes. And it's like you keep clicking update and it keeps trying to make you update. I think Warpcast, the Farcaster client, has that problem where the desktop client, sometimes it's like it's caught in an install update loop. And when I think about, all right, what happens if you multiply that problem by a distributed network? and it starts to look extremely, I don't know, intractable. And I don't think this is like a optics or customer service thing, and I don't think like Cloudflare being held up as a better alternative is actually like better management practices or like more enlightened systems, sysops and DevOps processes. I think maybe Cloudflare might be slightly better, but perhaps their application is simply less complex and they got lucky. And this sort of thing I think is on my mind because when I talk to people who are used to traditional systems, they kind of almost dismiss this stuff. Like I remember talking to like some famous computer people about what would happen if you had an update to Tesla's on-the-air updates that break them all or made them do some dangerous behavior, like, you know, if they're like doing some autonomous driving and the following distance is too small and it runs into each other. And this was several years ago, and the guy kind of dismissed it as, oh yeah, if you have like mature, well-managed update processes, this can't happen. And the accident that happened recently on the Bay Bridge, it seems like it was that kind of update. So I'm not sure people actually understand the foundations of basically fault tolerance and robustness and resilience in distributed systems. And when they don't, but they think they do, things that are really fundamental, like scientific unknowns, start to look like, I don't know, bad customer service or bad management. So I don't know what to think. I didn't come up with a good mental model or metaphor for this either, but I did think of like maybe a restatement of the CAP theorem or something like that for distributed system service availability. So maybe it's something like low downtime, or what you might call like hot swappability is one node. Maybe another node is rollback ability. Like if something breaks, can you roll back to the last known good state? Maybe that's another vertex of the triangle. And the third one might be, I don't know what the third one is. I had it in mind, but I forgot it. But yeah, maybe there's a way to state the fundamental trade-offs of like distributed service availability. But yeah, that's all I had. Second round comments, open up.
Yeah. Well, sorry. I just want, you were looking for, I think, a metaphor for this, and I put down the reality has more detail than you wish it did. The rationalists have, I've heard them say, I'm not a rationalist, I don't want to get into that, but reality has a surprising amount of detail. I always try to think of that more as like reality has a horrifying amount of detail. But at the end of the day, it's not like they knew this was. No one sat down and thought this was a good idea. No one said the knowledge that, all right, you should, stagger your updates, do everything proper, have a good, as the guy you were talking to said, have a good update, procedure. They all knew that, but they didn't know that they didn't know that they didn't have that. And until reality reared its ugly head, and everything blew up, they didn't realize that they had a method because they thought they had a good one. But the reality has more detail than they were even imagining. And then, 99.9% of the time that detail doesn't matter until it does. And then it matters a lot. And that's my metaphor for these kind of crashes. Not sure if that helps or answers your question.
Oh, one partial metaphor I did come up with that I don't know how to complete is the ship of Theseus. So you've all probably heard of that. It's the legend of the ship where you try and replace one piece at a time, like maybe a mast, maybe like a plank on the deck or something. And then the question is, when you've replaced all the pieces, do you still have the same ship? So I was thinking of this as kind of like a distributed ship of Theseus. And what you're thinking about is like when you ask, is it the same ship, you're asking about continuity of identity, right? Like if you replace every atom in your body, like suddenly by magic, are you still the same person? Like subjectively, will you feel like the same person? It's that kind of question. And with a distributed system, I think you have like a more subtle version of the same question, which is you have like a zillion nodes, all of them are running, some Linux version, and then the next version has to be updated, and if it works well, there should be a continuity of system identity. It's the same system, right? But if it doesn't work, it's kind of like the emergent identity of the distributed system kind of dies, and then it kind of gets resurrected. So I don't know if that's helpful, but distributed ship of Theseus maybe.
Jen, I find I don't want to jump in on the first round because but I'm interested to jump in on the second round because part of it is, compared to like people I know just around, I am wizardry in my understanding of technology. When I hang out in this crowd, of course, I feel like the muggle. And so I'm honestly thinking about like what percentage of humanity has the chops to even have a chance at being like one of these Datadog engineers and understanding enough of that system to keep the wheels from falling off. So like what's the constraint societally for, if we only have 0.0001% of people who even have a shot at making these systems run, that's an important thing to think about as we go forward with these super complicated systems. And two related pieces, Brian Johnson's been coming up a little bit on our server because he's really into going at the science. Vega, I hope it's okay if I mention it, that you know him a little bit and that he's really, he's just exploding in my YouTube. But there's a certain level of chutzpah that I think of, and in his case, it's fine. He can go do what he wants with his life. But there are two novels that are on my mind because Aurora, one of the Kim Stanley Robinson, is one of these long space voyages where they've recreated human systems, whole life forms. They've got bison on the ship, sailing boats, all kinds of stuff. The parent of one of the lead characters, her job is to keep these systems from failing. So everybody who's had a fishbowl knows how easy it is for the fishbowl to just go wacko. And so biological systems are inherently out there at the edge of crash all the time. The other one that I'm reading right now is The Terraformers by Annalee Newitz. It's new this year, so it's kind of similar. They're the main characters are the ones who are trying to keep these biological systems off on these terraformed planets running. And so the essential chutzpah of, can we even get there? Is it even possible? And, you guys who know more science, there may be some hard limits there that people want to talk about. But in the meantime, since we know they're going to fail sometimes, like what Datadog did to recover from that whole blow up seems, it's all pretty reasonable from that perspective. So that was my second round chime in.
Yeah, there's something there connecting what you said, Jenna, with what Ben was talking about. Like I remember reading somewhere that when Einstein first developed relativity, people were like unable to form adequate mental models of it. And I forget who it was, somebody who said that there's only 5 people in the world smart enough to understand relativity. And that's, of course, wrong in its most basic form, because today it's like standard undergrad curriculum for most STEM disciplines. So there's like literally millions of people who understand at least special relativity at a basic level. So that's one thought. The other thought is this whole reality has and it's a surprising amount of detail. That's the John Salvatierre blog post, I think, which we've cited a lot. How do you connect the two thoughts? That on the one hand, there are these things that look like they're extremely challenging, that only few people can understand, but a century later, millions do. On the other hand, you do keep running into these things of like devil in the details kind of stuff that keeps blowing up in your faces. And I suspect what happens is that if you have a theory of a complex system, theories by their nature are kind of like, finite, elegant, comprehensible by a single mind. And Einstein may be like 10x smarter than the average human, but not, a million X. So in general, when somebody thinks a very difficult and complicated thought, so a theory, over decades, people simplify it, learn how to explain it, learn how to teach it. And over a couple of generations, one person becomes 5 persons, becomes millions of people. But what they understand is not the territory of reality. They understand a map of a theory that covers 99% of what you might care about most of the time, which means it's kind of like an illusion of comprehension. So arguably, you could say that today on paper, millions of people understand special relativity, but people who have to actually deal with special relativity, people designing telecom systems that actually deal with the speed of light, or GPS systems, they actually have to deal with the messy reality details of relativity theory. And at that point, I think their thinking is as error prone as ever. And it's not clear that a million people are competent to handle that kind of thinking. Because the test of whether you're actually able to handle a complex domain is not whether you can like pass an exam and get a passing grade, or whether you can impress other people by explaining it to them, but whether you can deal with that system in reality and recover from failures through your knowledge. And by that test, I think one way to think about like modernity is we have all these complex distributed systems and millions and maybe even hundreds of millions of people who have this illusion of comprehension and competence and mastery that's basically like fictional. And there are always these corner cases that'll blow up and show you that you don't actually know what you're talking about. So it's kind of a depressing thought, but that's the kind of like connection between Ben's and Jenna's thoughts that I had. Anyway.
Another thought I had was I feel like the closer to the hardware you get, the more complicated it gets. And so Kubernetes is like a technology that kind of abstracts the hardware and kind of allows you to make simple models so that you don't need to care as much about the details. And so I think there was a Whitehead quote about like stabilization is like automating a number of operations you can automate, and like Kubernetes kind of does that for you so that people don't need to dig into the details. And I feel like less and less people are digging into the details because you have these technologies that kind of automate a lot of the higher level things for like DevOps. In terms of this case, it's more of the lower level that kind of hit them because operating systems have so many configurations, so many different ways of doing things because it's closer to the hardware. And they kind of missed a little configuration where they're, oh, it's auto updating, and they didn't even realize it. And then that's ultimately what hit them. Moving from like standard software development with web apps or with web apps and mobile to like DevOps, I found that DevOps to be a lot more, has a lot more detail, because like you have so many little pieces with so many different names, and they're all very, very specific, rather than staying into like one language and like that language works in that way, but you don't have to like learn another thing with its own specific ways of doing things and intricacies. And so there's a lot more detail to be had when you work closer to the hardware at the OS level, I find. So yeah, that's some thoughts.
What you said just reminded me of the other reading we did recently. I think it was in this group, the Rust programming language and the Linus Torvalds rant about how Rust people are deluded. I think you were on the call, Stephen, and it might have been you who brought that up. But yeah, like Linus basically ranting against Rust people, pretending that they can get away from the hard constraints of kernel programming with memory protection and so forth. So it reminds me of that. It's almost like the higher level abstraction things like Kubernetes or Rust are like, I don't know, classical Newtonian mechanics, and then you apply it to like these relativistic systems at the hardware level, and it kind of blows up in your face when you're, hitting something like the speed of light limit. And yeah, that Whitehead quote was also on my mind, since we reference it a lot in the Summer Protocols work. All right. More thoughts?
Yeah, so to go back on what I see, so Jenna called it Ben's theorem, reality has a horrifying level of detail. I always find it, I always couch that in negative terms now because of what I'm building and how so many it's like every time I do something new, it's like, oh, I have to run into my own design choices that I made months or years ago. And it's like, oh, look, man-made horrors of my own creation. Every time. Because even if I had a very clear idea in my head of what I wanted to do, it always ends up with I had to do more, or because I had maybe a spec or an idea, but now I have a data structure. And the data structure wants its own things. And now I'm having to fight the data structure I created. So it's just, I don't know. It's humorous, but it's also horrifying, and it's just, what happens when you try to do something. Anyway. Anyone else have any other thoughts? I think I might have.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. I was just making my closing remarks. Yeah, anybody else have any other thoughts? Sorry. All right. If not, let's call it early today and see you guys next week.